Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well at the back? Thank you. That's a yes. Welcome to this wonderful place, Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh. It's really great to see so many folk. This is an event that's also recorded, so hello to everyone also following us online. Thank you for masking up so beautifully. Can I ask, before we do anything else, that everyone checks their phones are off or on silent? Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Bushra from Hajar Press to just tell us a few words about this beautiful book, and then we'll be listening to more. Thank you, Issa. Hello, can people hear me? Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're so excited and grateful to be hosting this discussion at Lighthouse Books. My name is Brechna, and I am one of the co-publishers of Hajar Press. Farhana is the second co-publisher. She's somewhere in this room. I just wanted to say a little bit about the press before we begin, if that's okay. So Farhana and I set up Hajar in 2020, 2.5 years ago now. And by the end of this year, we'll have published 9 books. We set up Hajar when quite a lot was happening in the world. We were navigating the heartbreak of the 2019 election. We were about to head into a lockdown, and we were seeing huge protests against police violence. And so that's kind of the context and what was happening in the world. In terms of our industry, Farhana and I have been working in publishing for a while, and we were feeling pretty frustrated with the racism and elitism of our industry and its superficial gestures towards diversity. And we felt like commercial pressures were stifling creativity, particularly in the context of writers of color who are expected to fit into a certain mold to guarantee sales for a publishing house. In the context of the pandemic, we saw that a lot of presses were seriously questioning their publishing models. But we felt like these problems had existed for a really long time. We didn't think that Hajar was going to challenge Amazon's market domination or address the atomization of readers and writers. But we wanted to create a space where we could experiment and try to do things differently. We have one line that we say a lot that we kind of use to guide our work. And that's, there's no either or between the beautiful and the revolutionary. Our goal is to build this beautiful body of literature that honors our histories, imagines new possibilities, and strengthens our collective power. I can't really say how proud we are to be hosting this launch for You Must Believe in Spring today at Lighthouse Books. Muhammad's book really captures everything that Hajar is about. And we're just so grateful to you for trusting us with your work. And we're so grateful to Essa for joining us this evening. And I can't wait for this discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Brechna. That's really a lovely introduction to the spirit of the book and how it was made and built in collaboration and care. There's so much care in this book and so much care in this wonderful man who is not only a beautiful writer, he has a PhD in creative writing from the University of Edinburgh. So respect. I mean, that's already extremely amazing. He's also a ceramic artist and an architect and a triathlete. Once a triathlete, always a triathlete. So just so much respect for Mo, and I would like to hear some more applause to celebrate this beautiful book, You Must Believe in Spring, which launches here and now and today. And applause. So my name is Asa. I am a writer and a scholar, and it's such a joy to be about to dive in, pun intended, to this book. If anyone has had a little glimpse, there's a lot about swimming and about water and about depths, and it's a book that goes into the depths of archive and of memory. So I thought that would be a really interesting place to start exploring from the role of archive and memory in telling stories about events that are not always easy, in the book itself and in the making of the book.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much, Becca, for all of the lovely words and for all of you for being here. Memory and archive. Yeah, I think it was definitely something that was at the forefront for me when I was writing this book, especially because I was trying to essentially project the reader and the protagonist into some sort of imagined future, and to give space so I can look back on the events of 2011 with a bit of distance and kind of to actually see how these how all of these events will be gathered, relived through people, and kind of, yeah, what will they mean for people kind of in 20 years' time? And especially because
events of 2011 in Tahrir Square. So yeah, that's.
Yeah. So the 2011 events in the Tahrir Square of the Egyptian Revolution. It was obviously kind of like a very traumatic time for a lot of people. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of drive. There was a lot of feeling of the potential for change that kind of didn't pan out for so many different reasons. But yeah, I was more interested in kind of how those memories would be held and kind of what they would mean for people, and especially kind of when it comes to memories of people who actually lived through the events, because for a lot of them they have sustained massive amounts of trauma, and trauma kind of very much disrupts your ability to kind of like recollect certain memories. So it's like it's impossible to archive. So how would that fit in? Because it's also kind of such an integral thing to consider, especially when we are trying to build for future movements. So yeah.
Yeah, and the idea of trying to build a book centered around such events that are part of a collective memory in the sense of world news, but also deeply individual to the people who were there. And there's a beautiful sentence that you write about, it's like launching an arrow into the dark. There's so many wonderful sentences in all of this book, just beautiful, poetic. And this was also really interesting as a writer. You know, you're crafting a book like launching an arrow forward into the dark, and it's about your choice of setting it like in an imagined future from now, not just from 2011. So could you talk a bit about that, and then I would love to hear you read as well from your book.
So yeah, so as you may or may not know, the book kind of takes place across two timelines. So one that's 2011 and its aftermaths, and the other timeline is in 2031. So 2011 is Hanan, and 2031 is Fal Shahid, her son. And yeah, so the arrow kind of thrown into the dark. It's very much, yeah, the arrow kind of thrown into the dark was very much about trying to just imagine what kind of future the stories that we tell of the past will what kind of future that will actually result in. Especially kind of like as that future kind of started unfolding kind of day by day with every news story. But yeah, I kind of felt like just making a leap so I can almost try to exercise a certain possible future that can happen, because like the future here is very bleak. So I think part of me also just wanted to imagine that possibility as a way, almost feeling like that maybe if I wrote it down, it will not come to pass. And yes.
Feeling your way around possibilities, both past and future. So it's not quite a mystery story, but there's a lot of trying to work out what happened and who did what and how did things work out. So I think this is a good time to ask you to read a bit of the book, to give us a taste of not just the quality of the words and the writing, but the sense of atmosphere that is so well created in both timelines by this wonderful man.
Thank you. So I'll be reading from a chapter that's like a few pages on into the book, just when Hanan, Shahid's mother, first gets arrested in Tahrir Square in November 2011. It was only after she was arrested that my mother realized how unhappy she had been for most of her life. Tita gifted her the name Hanan, which was widely viewed as an ironic choice, given my mother's lack of warmth and decidedly ungentle nature. Of course, for irony to have been the intent, my grandmother would have needed to look into Mama's future. And if that were the case, it would only mean Tita deserved her own reputation as a cruel, domineering person who made a joke of what her daughter would grow up to feel most fragile about, before she even had the chance to prove herself otherwise. When Mama was arrested, she dropped her phone, denting the casing. That was 20 years ago. It was another November, and police had been picking off protesters by the Corniche as they left Tahrir Square. Mama had just delivered a carton of wound dressings, antiseptic fluid, inhalers, and juice boxes to Masjid Omar Makram in an attempt to live up to her name. She had promised her mother that she wouldn't go down to Tahrir. As far as Tita knew, Hanan was at home with her husband. As far as Baba knew, she was with her mother, trying to keep her busy and away from the field hospitals. That was exactly where Tita wound up, tending to casualties being rushed in on motorcycles from a raging battle with the police on Muhammad Mahmoud Street, a few hundred meters from where her daughter was leaving the mosque. Mom heard the explosions of tear gas grenades. Bang, bang, and decided that it was time to go home. I stroked the phone's bruise and imagined my mother being pushed into a blue police van, steadying herself with one hand in the rough grip of an officer, the hidden device sliding perilously down her trouser leg as she raises her foot to clamber on board the vehicle. I see the young boy, already seated in the van, who notices her struggling and swiftly grabs the phone with his feet before the impact can rattle, hiding it in his slipper under the arch of his foot. He presents it to my mother once she has settled into the darkness and gentle jostling of the metal cage, transporting them who knows where. Wiping the screen on his torn t-shirt, he apologizes for his dirty feet before asking whether she has enough credit for him to call his mother. Mama is pregnant with me, but isn't showing yet. When she said this to the police officer who dragged her to the van, he scanned her skeptically before replying, "We'll find you a place to sit on the bench then. You've a long drive ahead of you." Every so often, the blackness in the van is interrupted by streetlights glaring through the small mesh window that hardly lets in enough oxygen for the people inside to breathe. With every brief flash of bright orange, I see the scene change in front of Mama's eyes. But when I try to picture her there, I see nothing. Not even her face. Its nose gently rounded like a little piece of rolled dough, or her square jaw and high cheekbones, which give her an air of gravity, as though she were built of stacked bricks, drawing a wall between her and the rest of the world. Mama told me herself that her mind at the time was blank. She sat in silence, simply waiting to see where she would end up. She was terrified of calling Baba, who had messaged her to say he hoped the wannabe revolutionaries' mindless actions wouldn't keep the fish he'd ordered for dinner from arriving warm. Mm-hmm. The thought of Teta's voice on the phone was equally terrifying. The woman, as Mama called her mother in moments when Teta inspired her fear and love, barely answered calls, and whenever she did, it was always to give Mama advice she hadn't asked for. She nodded to the boy, signaling that he could make his phone call. Hearing his mother on the line, the boy's resolve to tell her about his situation failed at the last moment. Why would I be in Tahrir? He laughed. I'm with my friends. We're going to the internet cafe. I'll be out for a while. I'm whispering because it's busy on the bus. Mama, I swear, it's all good. Nobody in the van made a sound. If the boy's mother could believe that he was safe, then maybe he was. Maybe they all were. Maybe arresting them was just a scare tactic, one that was working. Mama, who wasn't yet Mama, was scared. Her surroundings suddenly reflected what Teta referred to as Hanan's cold heart, a prison of someone else's creation, in which it was impossible to dream of freedom. The boy handed Mama her mobile back. She stroked the jagged dent in the casing, which her touch would gradually wear smooth over the following years. The new edge was still sharp, and she pressed her finger against it, hoping the searing sensation would wake her up and jolt her into calling for help. It didn't. Mama knew the reason why she had stayed silent while the boy lied to his mother was that she didn't know whether she had the strength to admit her situation either. She always found that she needed to merit saving before she could let herself be saved. Boba had just started the espresso machine when Tita's keys clicked in the door lock the next day. She had left the field hospital at 5 in the morning when the explosions of thunder and cracking of bullets from Muhammad Mahmoud Street had died down. Instead of going home and trying to sleep, she thought to pick up fresh fruit from a nearby stall and drop them off at her daughter's place. The wet season had come early in Aswan, so persimmons and dates had already arrived. They were bitter, she noted, but it was better than nothing. What's a winter without persimmons? Tita asked the vendor as he placed 2 kilograms of the fruits into a black plastic bag, slick and slippery from his wet hands. The first stretch of Muhammad Mahmoud was lined with shops and boarded up fast food restaurants. Further up, the street turns into a tunnel with the polygonal brutalist concrete wall of the American University's library, enclosing one side, and the lime-washed brick of the university campus rising on the other. Between these indifferent faces of the city, 50 people would die over 3 days. The character of the walls changed, once stoic, bitter, and mundane. They became willfully indifferent to the fire, the clang of metal pipes against cars, the pop of tear gas, the blasts of shotguns. Whenever the city's labyrinth untangles itself into sheer, sharp lines, someone is bound to get brutalized. Tita opened the door of Mom and Baba's apartment to the noise of the espresso machine rumbling like an engine on its last legs. Hanan, she called, her tongue wrapped tightly around my mother's name, conferring on it a customary extra syllable for fear of what might happen to tenderness and warm hearts if left alone.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed throughout the book was the deep attention to detail of the world beyond humans as well. There's so much careful observation of people and how they can be loving or really not to each other, but also the world beyond humans. And even, you know, in this, what you've read about the persimmons and the way the city is a labyrinth or not. And I would love, there's a quote that I loved it so much about Cairo. It was such a character in the book, the city and space, and a presence. Its magic is its elegance as a labyrinth, a place, and it's a place with many centers. So the idea of an elegant labyrinth, whilst being a place with many centers. We've had a taste of some of the writing, but I wonder if you could talk about the place itself, Cairo, and then the desert, and then Egypt as somewhere that, yeah, where the story happens, but people want to stay and make it better, but are also desperate to leave. That feels like a really important pull as part of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think definitely Cairo for me, it almost feels like, yeah. All of the writing for this book kind of happened when I was away. And when I was based here in Edinburgh. And it definitely, it feels sometimes like a cliche to say that it feels like a character in the story, but I definitely also wrote it as, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but especially because Cairo and the way that the city is set out and the way that, for example, I didn't get to it in such a direct manner in the book, but the way that there are no public spaces, there is no way for you to actually exist within the city outside of kind of like going somewhere private, paying a certain fee. So spaces are very restricted based on kind of like your means, your ability, what you look like, everything, and that kind of was very much integral to the protagonist experience of the space, because obviously he has to kind of like almost police himself, and it's all to do with how the city is laid out. The city is laid out so that you're constantly moving, you're constantly trying to get somewhere, you're constantly kind of like trying to survive the oppressive atmosphere around you, and there's no way there's literally physically no space for you to sit and relax. And that kind of like felt like an important thing to bring across. And obviously the book doesn't just take place in Cairo, but it also travels a bit further across Egypt. So as Shahid actually goes away from Cairo, he sees other possibilities of like living and existing and interacting with space, where it's a lot more dynamic than almost trying to resist it and just trying to get through it. Like the whole idea of a city with many centers is because it constantly tries to draw you out into a certain direction that's not exactly where you want to be. And I think that's, yeah.
That it has many centers, but one heart, and that heart is Tahrir Square. And what did that feels really important as well.
Yeah, definitely, because many centers and one heart being Tahrir Square, because it's always, even since 1977, the bread riots, people went down to Tahrir Square and protested, and whenever there was any sort of massive movement, people always kind of like ended up going down to Tahrir Square. But I think part of the book also was trying to, like, by taking Shahid out of that context, trying to almost decenter that a wee bit, because I feel like there can almost be too much emphasis on Cairo as kind of like the most important bit, but like the second half of the book, or actually kind of like 2/3 of the book, happens outside of Cairo, and that's also, and even in kind of revolutionary movements, it's quite often that people in Alexandria would go out and actually protest first and kind of like stand up for people's rights. The very first marches for Khalid Said, like 2010 and 2011, Khaled Said was someone who was brutally killed by the police while in custody, and then they tried to kind of say that he died by asphyxiation when he tried to swallow a bag of hashish that he had on him. But the truth was, they just beat him to death. Police brutality was rampant. And but yeah, the movements and the protests started elsewhere, and then they eventually kind of like filtered into Cairo. And I kind of wanted to take Shahid essentially out of his comfort space.
And Shahid seeks comfort throughout the book and respite and release, and it feels as if he finds it. I don't want to give away too much, but water. Can we talk about water and swimming? Okay, he finds respite and relief in swimming, and I'd love to hear from you about the really rich image of going like diving and swimming, and he finds respite in poetry as well. And at one point, there's another amazing line where he's reading poems and unfurling lines like rays of sunlight on the seafloor. So the idea of swimming and finding peace or solitude, but in the imagined future, the Nile is drying up. So there's this sense of trying to find something that flows, and but at the same time, the sense of water running out. So that would be great to hear more about.
Yeah, and another part of that as well is that the pool that he's swimming in, and this is something that's revealed very early on, because the pool technicians had been arrested, so there's no chlorine, and so they've been purifying it with benzene, which obviously you don't really want. That was a thing, kind of like back in the day, but I kind of like in this imagined future, I imagined it kind of like almost making a comeback out of necessity. But so even this place where he does find freedom, essentially is pretty much toxic to him. And when writing it, kind of in my head, it was because also the freedom that he experiences within that water is something that the rest of the world can never live up to. Because in that space, he can kind of like almost express himself, flow. He can really find a sense of freedom and movement that exists kind of outside of those boundaries. Yet, yeah, and but yeah, and there's also kind of like another scene where he talks about kind of like swimming in the sea within the context of a race, and it's definitely something that gives him like feeling of freedom and the ability to kind of break out of the boundaries of that the city imposes upon him and that the authoritarian regime imposes upon him. But still, it also kind of like finds its way back because the Federation is run by ex-army and ex-military officers. So they still kind of like manage to poison that well.
And the river is drying up, and yeah, there's all sorts of really powerful images, and also names I felt were really carefully chosen. I don't know if it was deliberate, but could you talk about the names and some of the names and their meanings, like Hanan and Shahid and Hilal? And
so Shahid means witness or kind of observer, and that was chosen almost very deliberately, and it was chosen in a way I almost kind of like, a part of me almost wanted to throw readers off to make them feel like there was that it was potentially not his real name. But that kind of like the reality of it kind of like, I don't know if I should ruin this or not. But essentially it is his real name, but because the way that, I don't know, I've experienced names in Egypt, and in discussions, like a lot of my other friends have also experienced it the same way. Your name in Egypt, we kind of have 4 names and kind of like laid out against each other. They're essentially your identity, and they're the ones that you always kind of like put on official papers. And it almost feels very restrictive because it feels like walking around with your social security number being said out loud by everyone. Because, but I just wanted him essentially to have an opportunity to almost like through the narrative to merit that name. Like it, upon first glance, it can feel made up, but he tries to earn it. Shahid, yeah. I think maybe same root letters. I think shahad, which is to witness, and maybe kind of like martyrdom as to have been witnessed, kind of like in an act of sacrifice. But and then hanan is gentleness and kind of like good-naturedness and kindness. And obviously there's another very integral character called Nizam, which means order, and in certain contexts can mean regime as well. But I won't say more about that though.
And another thing I really appreciated about this book, and really chimed with your introduction of what you're trying to do at Hajar, was your choice. And so the choice of names is really careful and is connected to the story. And the choice throughout the book of putting in dialogue, putting Arabic, Egyptian Arabic expressions without apology in the shape of italics or without brackets, which are often like apologies. Sorry, I have to tell you what this means. So there's a really bold choice of not translating, not putting in italics. And I thought it was great. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that as well.
So the Arabic was a very kind of deliberate choice to kind of present it in a way that wasn't Fusha as well, so wasn't kind of the literary Arabic, because it felt like that's, as an Arabic speaker, that's a lot of what I'm used to reading off of the page, but it doesn't really kind of like resonate with me on a body level. I don't kind of like feel the words really landing sometimes. I can read it and make sense of it, but it doesn't really land. But just reading a lot of poets and a lot of other experimental writers in Arabic who do kind of write in a vernacular was so freeing. And it felt like almost like a form of resistance, because this is kind of a form of Arabic that's a lot more accessible. This is what most people kind of like speak out on the street. And to kind of like be able to wield a proper sort of literary Arabic, you have to have had a certain level of education. And and so I just wanted to kind of allow for a space for that kind of like alternative form of expression to emerge. And because it does feel significant, and it does kind of like important to give the space for.
And I really appreciated that there was a publishing house that was possible to happen in. So lots of respect for that. And also
because Hajar Press were also the ones who kind of like very much encouraged me to kind of like remove the italics, because obviously when writing it, kind of, because this was also partly written for the PhD, but kind of like writing it for the PhD, they needed the italics, because the explanation almost, or just to highlight it, but just kind of like it was so lovely to actually find a space and find a publishing house that's kind of like allowed you that freedom, where it's kind of like, no, this has its place among the rest of the narrative. This doesn't have to kind of like appear as some other.
Yeah, and it's really cleverly and well done, so that it doesn't interrupt the meaning or the story at all. It's more like an added flavor or an added sound that makes it what it is. And on the theme of sounds, one thing I loved was opening the book and then finding playlist. I don't know if you've looked at that. Yeah, I mean, obviously you're listening, not reading, but I love the idea that there's a playlist to go with the book. And I'd love to hear more about that. Have you ever found a book like that? I've never yet. And I don't know, it's like a few pages in before the story starts. And so then I found it on Spotify, and it exists. It's like, it's a playlist. It's just excellent. So can you tell us about that a bit?
Yeah, so this is actually like a feature in all of Hajar Press's books. So every book comes with a curated playlist from the authors, and it was actually quite a tough thing, because I was like, oh, do I want to go for vibe or soundtrack? And kind of like, how far do I go? I'm like, this might take maybe 8 hours to read. An 8-hour playlist felt like a bit too much. So it's not 8 hours, but yeah. But then choosing the songs, there were a lot of them were songs that I was listening to quite a bit. So Iskandarella, for example, they're an incredible group that's really prominent during the 2011-2013 uprisings in Egypt. And they reinterpreted a lot of songs by Sheikh Imam, who was also in his own right just an incredible musician and wrote a lot of protest songs. And one of his songs also kind of like makes it to the playlist, Shahid Usurak, which is just a very old protest song. And the other ones are just the ones that kind of like kept me company, but also that a lot of them correlate to certain parts of the book and almost like in my mind play a certain role as well, like along with the narrative. So yeah.
I love that all the books you publish have that. That is really wonderful. I'm aware that I want to leave time for questions, but I would love you to talk a bit more about the cover of the book and this bird in particular, and not, without giving too much away, but its role in the story. And I have to draw attention to Mo's nail art. Please hold up your hands. It's just wonderful. And it features the design of the book cover. So this is another reason for everyone to go and get books signed after so you can admire his nails. But I'd love to hear more about this bird.
So this bird is the hopu or hudhud in Arabic. And so it's the bird that there's an ancient kind of like epic Sufi poem by Farid ad-Din al-Attar called Conference of the Birds. And it's all about a group of flock of birds led by the hopu, who go out in search of Simur, who's the king of the birds, and kind of like within the context of the poem, Simur is meant to kind of like be a stand-in for God, Allah, and and kind of the whole thing is at the end they kind of can't really reach Simur, but they can only kind of like just meditate upon their existence, and it's such a beautiful poem, and it played kind of rather, I feel like a bit of the book borrowed almost a bit of structure from it, because it's all about kind of moving forward through space and across different landscapes. And even kind of in the poem, there was many times kind of like mention of wide landscapes filled with desolation that absolutely kind of like terrified them. And terror and fear is a common theme in the book. Actually that might be it. Yeah.
Also, beauty and resistance is very much woven through. I'm going to pass back, so it's not just terror and fear.
Yeah, no, definitely beauty and resistance, and kind of like trying to find some sort of actual human connection and striving to, just almost build intimacies with others, and it's in a space and place that forces you to put on a certain mask and certain face that might otherwise just not allow for that.
I'm going to check now if there's any questions from the room and alert anyone online who might be thinking of questions to put them on the chat, and Mari will read them out. So are there any folk here who would like to ask Mo a question about the book or about anything?
Well, there's one online.
There's one online.
Kicked off with.
Go for it.
Anya's asking, was there anything that felt too taboo or too fragile about Egypt at that time to put on the page?
Did everyone hear that? Okay, yeah, great.
Yes and no. It's, I think, having kind of built the novel and the narrative in a certain way, and especially kind of like using the point of view of just essentially a young Muslim man, there was yeah, like there, I could only kind of like build up the way that he dwells on the past in a very specific way that kind of like just wasn't gratuitous. And yeah, especially kind of like when it comes to the violence and the oppression that kind of like just occurs within the book, it was important to, yeah, just not, just not have it there for the sake of having it there and for the sake of almost just throwing the history out there. It still needed to make sense kind of within the novel and the manuscript and the protagonist's point of view. And yeah, especially, and that kind of like goes back to the whole idea of memory and archiving. Just kind of, yeah, he only carries kind of like memories in a certain way because he exists in only kind of like a certain manner and within certain limitations given his surroundings.
Yeah. And there's a quote that I had to write down because it was so great that is really related to that. To claim to have the complete picture of anything is its own form of tyranny, since it denies others the ability to add their experiences to the mix. So could you maybe expand on that a bit? And it feels connected to taboo and to some things that have to be suppressed and some things that have to be brought out under force.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's I think it's because the first impulse that I had when writing this was to put down everything. And that was exactly. And to be fair, the first drafts were probably just mostly word vomit. But I mean, all first drafts, of course. But then it was important to kind of figure out the heart within it, because trying to produce a kind of like something that purports to actually be a complete archive, I mean, yeah, like as the quote said, nobody can hold that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. As I said. Yeah. Yeah. As I said in this book. Yeah, to kind of like purport to kind of like have a complete archive is its own form of tyranny, because essentially while he kind of like goes through all the different spaces where just and kind of like reflects on other people's suffering and kind of like Coptic people, Nubian people, but it's still kind of like it couldn't. I wanted to kind of like not try to almost like overly saturate, especially kind of like given where the protagonist is writing from. For if he had tried to kind of like fill those shoes completely, that would have been wrong, because that's kind of like he doesn't hold all of that experience. He can only kind of bear witness and kind of allow space for it to happen and to reflect on it. But it was kind of like very important to draw that balance out. Yeah.
Thank you. A question from the very front. Maybe you could talk into this so everyone can hear you.
You spoke about how you didn't actually do any of the writing while you were still in Egypt. How did it feel like? I wondered if you're up for expanding on how it felt, sort of being away from the spaces you were describing and exploring, and are obviously so deeply connected to, whilst having to write about them in a place that's quite different in lots of different ways. I imagine, from the wet, like the desert, to sort of like the colds of Scotland, like kind of thing, to like different feelings of cities. Like, yeah, how did that feel for you doing it as opposed to for within the book?
It was I don't want to say it was difficult. It was somehow easier to write with a certain bit of distance, because it allowed me just a bit of perspective on that space, and especially kind of allowed me to imagine it differently, kind of and as always within the book, just Cairo and Egypt can be quite overwhelming when you're there. So to almost to try to write from within that and embody that experience, whatever kind of like came out onto the page didn't really make much sense. But with actually a bit of remove, it was a bit easier in this, especially kind of feeling a sense of safety, because I think that was a big thing of kind of having that remove and that bit of distance. Because obviously, kind of having experienced the events of 2011, there was quite a bit of drama attached to the spaces, and that kind of comes with its own difficulty, especially when you revisit those times and places. So being able to actually know that you're safe and have that distance was important, because then it allows you to kind of like dip into it and actually sink in, knowing that you have the safety to come back out of it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from online or the room? Mari's checking. Oh, right at the back. If you ask it, I'll repeat it on the microphone for people listening online. So go for it here.
Try to ask it loudly.
Yes. Thank you.
So I had a question about the city, I guess, as a character. So there's a lot of, as already mentioned, there's so much gentle attention paid to the city. The way you describe it, it's so precious and so loving. Like there's such fine detail noticed about the city, even though the space itself is really in some ways harsh and barren and even violent. It almost feels like the protagonist has this nostalgia and almost wish for how the city could have been, for kind of a wasted potential. So it feels like Shahed is very nostalgic about Cairo, how it used to be. So I was just wondering whether that trend, or what do you think about that observation, and whether that trend of that type of wasted potential is something that you saw maybe being on set after the revolution, or whether that was a progression, a trajectory existing already before that.
So I'll just repeat the question for the online people. So the question was about the city as a character and noticing how much care and gentle attention was put in the descriptions of the city itself as a place, even though then it became a dangerous and violent place. It felt as if there was a sense of longing for a place that could have been, or a way the city could have been. And so that, what do you think of that observation? And also, do you think that that was a trend that was that happened with the revolution and after the revolution, or was already happening?
So you always kind of exist and move through the space, and it affects you, and it affects how you kind of realize your own narrative. And so I think that's always going to be why any space like that, even if it's a bit difficult, there's always a sense of being precious about it, because it allows you to access a certain part of yourself that's otherwise just not there, and that part of yourself that actually helps you survive. While it can be very restrictive because it allows you only a limited set of emotions and interactions with the people and the spaces around you, it's still there to keep you safe. So I think part of it is almost just, not wanting to kind of, or just, I guess kind of like nostalgia, kind of a yearning for the many possibilities of what you could be. Because whenever you move through a different space, you could always just be a different person. And Shahed, as he moves through different spaces, he kind of like puts on different hats essentially and becomes a different person. Yeah. And and that's just definitely very relevant to the story. But I think, I mean, for the purposes of the narrative, that's definitely something that the parts that he reflects on, a lot of them happened post-revolution, but also a lot of them existed before that. Like those trends in the city are from 19th century, since kind of like just the kings and the kind of decided to actually build on the Nile rather than use it as agricultural land because it was prettier, and they wanted to build a Paris on the Nile. And so it's definitely a trend that predates the revolution. I think just certain parts of it became much more exacerbated. And like you had pointed out before, especially the Nile drying up, I mean, that's also just kind of keeping in mind the Renaissance dam in Ethiopia, which is kind of going to drain the lifeline of Egypt, and also the massive water crisis that the whole world is going through. And so, yeah, I think it just the nostalgia for the space is also just a want for a time when you can actually imagine a different future besides the one that you have now. I think for Shahid, a huge part of kind of what he goes through is a struggle to actually imagine a different future than the one that's kind of like already laid out before him. And that's definitely something that's come from the intergenerational trauma because of the defeat and the disappointment of the 2011 revolution. It's kind of like what Ali Abdel Fattah said in one of his essays. Ali Abdel Fattah is one of the most kind of like prolific and incredible minds, who was writing way before the Egyptian revolution, kind of pointing out police brutality, and he's right now in prison and has been on a hunger strike for 200 days on Tuesday. And he said that the biggest change that will be evident between the 2011 revolution and the next one is during 2011 people were very hopeful, but with the next one, given the amount of disappointment and the fear that the army has actually kind of instilled in people, the outcome of it won't be hope, but it will be fear. And Shahid definitely carries kind of a lot of that fear. So yeah, nostalgia for the city is also nostalgia for actually being able to exist while feeling a certain sense of security.
Yeah, so much to think about. Oh, there's a question from online.
This one is from Mona, which ties into what you were saying just now, I think. With news coming out of Iran and the women and young people's uprising there, what role do you think art and literature play in these moments of revolution before and after?
That's an amazing question. Thank you. I think it just serves to help people process and actually kind of allow ourselves to kind of like get beyond the news and kind of like the immediate reactions of just what's happening, and rather than just being reactive and just on the receiving end, it allows people to actually speak back to all of those events, and not just to kind of like inform or educate or tell people about what's happening, but to actually to have your own say within it as well, and to just kind of like have your own opinion heard, because an uprising without actually kind of like having your voice heard, or actually kind of like speaking up, is a lost uprising, because there are as many kind of revolutions that need to happen as there are as many voices, because each of us has kind of experienced life differently, experienced space differently, and that's always kind of like important to note down. And again, talks back to kind of like unarchivable instances, and there will always kind of be those within uprisings.
I'm going to see if the microphone reaches as far as this person.
Yeah, I can just make it. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, so you mentioned when you were talking about Egyptian Arabic phrases in the book, that you didn't want to write them in Fusha because you sort of lacked a personal connection to it. And I was wondering if there was, at some points during the writing of this book, a similar feeling because you were writing about Egypt, not in Egyptian Arabic, but in English.
Thank you so much. I absolutely love that question, and it was something that was on my mind quite a bit. Why wasn't I why wasn't I writing this in Arabic rather than English? And I think part of it is almost, it's weird, but I kind of scapegoated Arabic as being the reason why I couldn't process a lot of the events that happened in 2011. It almost kind of like felt too close to home and kind of reminded me of that space that I was dwelling in, which was kind of like just very nihilistic, very fatalistic. And I almost sought kind of like a bit of distance by writing it in English. But then I found that I actually kind of like still struggled in the same way. And because it wasn't because like Arabic didn't suffice. I just, it was just too close to the events for me at that time, and I needed a bit of time and distance from it. But then, I just, it took a while to also key into the voice in English to make sure that I wasn't just translating whatever kind of like Arabic text I'll be putting down. But it definitely took a while to get there. I feel like I'm not answering the question, but it's it's like helped with a bit of distance. But also another thing, it's kind of like a bit of an aside, but also the ceramics. Ceramics is actually kind of like something that really somehow helped me key into the writing, because I started when I found myself struggling, even in English in that way, I felt that I couldn't communicate kind of outwardly about a lot of these experiences, and actually kind of engaging with the ceramics and kind of making something that essentially became an object that was very utilitarian and you can use and you kind of like can't deny it. Mm-hmm. It eluded translation and any of that. And that actually kind of like gave me a bit of confidence to go back and kind of like experiment with both and kind of like mash both together. And so, and then I just made sure to try to key into the voice in a very deliberate way that felt authentic in terms of the tempo, the pattern, the mannerisms kind of like within the speech itself, because it's all first person present. So it's very immediate. And I just needed that to be genuine and authentic to the Arabic.
And it works really well. So I am sad to say that it's already 8 o'clock, my watch tells me. So we're going to stop the conversation in this way. But there will be, oh no, you're not. No, I thought it was a hand on. Next door, there is a space where Mo will sign books, and maybe you can have a bit more interaction and admire his nails. Mm-hmm. But please join me in thanking Mo so much for writing this book and for being here this evening. Thank you.